Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are here with the next panel, which is a very interesting one, the Quad, the emerging Indo-Pacific Naval Alliance. The emerging alliance has come into prominence due to the aggressive posturing by China across the South China Sea and the Tibetan Plateau. The pandemic, the economic drop, Chinese brazen posture, and military forays have given rise to calls for a strong global alliance to check the dragon. The recent 2+2 meetings and the Malabar naval exercise all sharply bring into focus the need for a working and viable geostrategic alliance. The Indian island territories, the dominating location of the Andaman Nicobar Islands, and the criticality of the sea routes to China, despite heavy investment in the CPEC, will necessitate naval muscle and increased presence. The sea and the ocean route for China to the west is economically cost-effective. What are the choke points it will face to its sea power?
I'd like to introduce Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, who has over 35 years of rich and varied experience in the Indian Navy. In his seagoing career, he has held command of the Indian Navy frontline service combatants on 4 occasions. A navigation and direction specialist, he commanded the aircraft carrier INS Virat. He was also part of the fourth Indian scientific expedition to Antarctica. He took over as the Chief of Staff of the Western Naval Command in August 2009. He is the recipient of the Vishisht Seva Medal and the Ati Vishisht Seva Medal. Currently, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan is the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi, which is India's foremost resource center for the development and advocacy of strategies for the promotion and protection of India's maritime interests.
Dr. C. Rajamohan. Dr. Chilunkuri Rajamohan is an Indian academic, journalist, and foreign policy analyst. He began his academic career in the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. He is presently the director of the Institute of South Asia Studies, National University of Singapore. Dr. Mohan has had a distinguished academic service career, including that of being the founding director of Carnegie India and academic posts in universities in Singapore and Delhi. Dr. Mohan has had a number of stints in journalism as well. He was strategic affairs editor of the Indian Express and has also served as a diplomatic editor, the Washington correspondent of the Hindu newspaper. He now writes for the Indian Express. He is the author of several books, the latest being Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. He was awarded the highest French distinction of Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, Knight of the Legion Honor in 2016.
Shyam Saran. Shyam Saran was the Foreign Secretary to the Government of India, prior to which he served as India's ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, and Nepal, and as High Commissioner to Mauritius. Upon completion of his tenure as Foreign Secretary, he was appointed Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Indo-US civil nuclear issues, and later as Special Envoy and Chief Negotiator on climate change. In 2011, in recognition of his contribution to the civil service, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan.
Colonel David Randolph Scott, U.S. Air Force. He's a retired test pilot and the NASA astronaut who was the seventh person to walk the moon. As the commander of the Apollo 15, he flew 3 times in space and is the only living commander of Apollo mission that landed on the moon. Scott is now the last surviving crew member of Apollo 15. Before becoming an astronaut, Scott was in the Air Force, from where he retired as a colonel and has had more than 5,600 hours of logged flying time. As an astronaut, Scott made his first flight into space as pilot on Gemini 8 mission, along with Neil Armstrong in March 1966, spending just under 11 hours in the low Earth orbit. Scott then spent 10 days in orbit in March 1969 as command module pilot of Apollo 9, a mission that extensively tested the Apollo spacecraft along with Commander James McDivitt and lunar module pilot Rusty Sechwa.
To moderate this panel, we have Admiral Sunil Lamba. Sunil Lamba is a navigation and direction specialist who has served as a navigation and operations officer on board various ships both in the Eastern and Western fleets. For over 4 decades, he has served as a navigation officer on board INS Sindhudurg and INS Dunagiri, before serving as a commanding officer of various ships. He has also held numerous training positions. He is the recipient of the Vishisht Seva Medal and the Ati Vishisht Seva Medal. He became Chief of the Navy Staff on 31st May 2015, and soon after he took over as the Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. Currently, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan is the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi, which is India's foremost resource center for the development and advocacy of strategies for the promotion and protection of India's maritime interest. We invite you to begin the session.
Thank you, Vikramjit and Aradhika. Welcome to my co-panelist. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to discuss about the Quad. The genesis of the Quad goes back to the tsunami of 2004, in December 2004, where the four countries, that is the United States of America, Japan, Australia, and India, formed a core group for a joint response to the 2004 tsunami to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So that was the beginning. In 2007, when the then Prime Minister of Japan visited India, Mr. Shinzo Abe, he made a speech to the joint Parliament of India, a confluence of the two seas. And that started off the Quad, but Quad had a premature birth, wherein they did a joint exercise with Singapore. And in 2008, it died a natural death when Australia pulled out of it. Now, during the previous decade, there has been growing military might, especially the naval power of the Chinese. They invested a huge sum in modernizing the Navy, and no countries invested this kind of effort and money in developing a Navy post the Second World War. And as a maritime and national power has increased, there has been a great deal of aggressive behavior by China. They are signatories to a majority of international agreements, including UNCLOS, but they've cherry-picked the rules and regulations to their own devices and their own advantage to win at all cost. And the South China Sea is a prime example of this, where they have gone on island building effort. They've disregarded the International Court of Justice ruling on the South China Sea. With that, there was a new impetus for the Quad to get together back again. And since 2017, they started meeting at official levels, which has now been upgraded to the ministerial levels. The foreign ministers of the four countries have now met twice, the last being in October. The other issue which is being symbiotically being linked to the Quad is the Malabar. Malabar goes back to 1993, which was a bilateral exercise between the Indian Navy and the United States Navy. Thereafter, over all these years, Japan was included in Malabar, and now this year, Australia has been invited. So in the Malabar 2020, you had all four members of the Quad participating in the Malabar. So like it or not, the Malabar is being linked with Quad. With this as a backdrop, we have four panelists. I am not going to introduce them and waste time because it has already been done by the MC. The sequence would be Ambassador Sam Saran, followed by Vice Admiral Chauhan, and then Dr. David Scott, and finally Professor Raja Mohan, who is now based in Singapore. He'll give that aspect. So each of you will have 10 minutes. I'll give you a warning at 10 minutes to wind up. And thereafter, after all four of you have spoken, we'll open it out to question and answers. And finally, I'll give some time for final remarks to all four of you. Over to you, Ambassador Saran.
Admiral Lamba, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this very important subject of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific strategy. Let me also acknowledge my very distinguished panelists who are taking part in this military festival. It's an honor to be on the same platform as them. As you mentioned that, the Quad owes its origin to the tsunami of 2004-2005. In fact, the coordination body that you mentioned, in fact, was at the level of foreign secretaries. So I was actually interacting with my colleagues from these other three countries virtually on a daily basis in terms of, delivery of supplies and assistance to countries not only in South Asia, but also in Southeast Asia. And I think that was a display of the reach of India's naval forces, and the speed with which India reacted was something which really impressed other partners as well. As you also said, the idea of the Quad owes to the initiative of Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister. But I would like to just make a small sort of comment about why the Quad did not, in fact, continue and develop in that initial phase. The reason was that when the Prime Minister of India was going to Japan, in fact, I was called by my American counterpart to basically say that the United States of America wanted to play down the Quad because the United States of America was looking for Chinese and Russian support. For example, on the Iran nuclear deal, that was the time of the six-party talks on North Korea. That's nuclear issue, and therefore the United States of America did not want to unnecessarily antagonize its major partners, China and Russia, because of the requirement for their support. So it is really, that is really the reason why, after having had a secretary level meeting in Manila in 2007, this exercise did not go forward. Yes, it is true that in a sense a coup de grace was delivered by Australia, because they announced that, the only security arrangements they have is with the United States and with Japan, thereby implicitly saying we have nothing to do with India in a sense. So that's really the background. And I think that background is important to remember, because in taking this second edition of the Quad forward, I think it is important to remember that history. Now, what is different this time from the first iteration of the Quad? One, to my mind, is that, yes, the challenge to the Quad countries from a very aggressive, a very assertive China, which has dramatically built up its naval power, particularly in the South China Seas, the sense of threat perhaps is more than what it was at that time. That is one factor. The second factor to my mind is that, in a sense, the security relationships among the four countries involved has also, in fact, become much, much deeper. So we have these three foundational agreements now with the United States of America. We have also fairly strong, security arrangements with Japan on the one hand, with Australia on the other hand. These strong security arrangements did not exist at the earlier period. So in a sense, if we are looking at taking forward this initiative, the building blocks, in a sense, are already in place. I think that is an important aspect. The third aspect is that India, of course, while it is slowly moving to crystallize the accord, it is also at the same time mindful of the fact that the more plurilateral it is, the more participants there are in this initiative, perhaps it would be better in terms of how the Quad is seen outside the forum of these four countries. And in that context, I think it is very positive that ASEAN, which had some doubts about the Quad because they thought that this would in some way undermine ASEAN centrality, which they keep insisting upon, they have in fact at least cautiously come out with what is known as the Indo-Pacific outlook, which really looks at the maritime security in the particularly the South China Sea area. Second, that three important European powers, that is France, Germany, and the UK, have also, in a sense, sort of shown an interest in working together with other major partners in terms of the security of the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that is a good sign. The reason why I say this is that India's own approach to maritime security has been that whatever architecture arises, this architecture should be open, it should be transparent, it should be balanced, and it should be inclusive in character. So our preference would be for an inclusive, plurilateral maritime security architecture. So that keeps open the door for China also to join, provided it also adheres to the various norms and the rules that are necessary for sustaining such a maritime security architecture. So in that sense, our preference, as I said, is for a more plurilateral arrangement. And I think in that sense, if we are able to persuade China that its interests are better served by being part of this inclusive architecture rather than seeking unilateral dominance, then we are going to be making some progress. However, I would like to point out that as far as the current situation is concerned, there appears to be a judgment on the part of China that its power, based on its very impressive economic performance, is leading it to a position of preeminence, certainly in the Asian theater. And therefore, if that is its preeminence, then why does it need to actually adhere to some kind of a multilateral arrangement? Now, as long as that continues to be the Chinese approach, I think there is no alternative but for a strong countervailing coalition to really push back against this kind of aggressiveness. So much of the trajectory of the Quad going into the future, if we have to look at, will very much depend upon what China's own stance is going to be. I believe that, in fact, India should be less hesitant in taking this initiative forward, while retaining a degree of caution, as I said, because of the history that I mentioned. But I think there is no point in just having a consultative forum without any kind of a commitment to, in fact, taking this forward and crystallizing it. That's my my view. So I look at the future as something which is actually creating a more propitious kind of an environment for the Quad to become more, a much more credible kind of a forum. And also, I see a move by other partners to, in fact, in different ways, associate themselves with this. And the Quad, let me point out finally, that if you take the capabilities of the Quad countries together, they, in fact, are more powerful than China currently is. Therefore, it has that, credibility attached to it, which perhaps makes it a very very important initiative going forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Admiral Ambassadors Charan. Over to you, Admiral Chauhan.
Thank you very much. I presume you can hear me. Admiral Lamba and my co-panelists, I, like Ambassador Shamsaran, would like to start by acknowledging the presence of these luminaries and my singular sense of honor at being on the same platform as them. I wanted to say about 5 or 6 things in the 10 minutes allotted to me, and so I'll proceed without any further ado. These are basically, it's not my intention to give any sort of recap on the development of the Quad. That has already been done. I just wanted to correct 1 or 2 small points that were made right in the beginning, I think, by the MCs. The Quad is not a naval alliance. It's not an alliance at all. So that should be quite clear, even from Ambassador Shamsaran's own remarks. My first sort of recommendation, and that's where I would like to concentrate my my intervention. My first recommendation is that India and the Quad in general needs to internalize this concept of maneuver. We must be able to play and embrace asymmetries rather than falling into the trap of trying for symmetry in our approach, whether it is to do with China or anybody else. My second point is that in this particular case, if China is indeed a point of focus, if not the threat, then the region is best served by India attempting to utilize all the means at its disposal to actually knit or stitch the region together so nicely and tightly that China cannot find the cracks and the fissures through which to make an entry into this region. And so rather than meeting China head on, somewhat in the form of the enemy at the gate, it is better to provide for a region which itself becomes an impossibility, or at least an extremely difficult proposition for China to actually enter and to thereafter be forcing us to all react to it. So my fundamental belief is that India should not fall into the trap of symmetry, and that we must not try to cut our coat according to our cloth. Now, this is a very, very important thing because Indians tend to downplay themselves a great deal. And we must not cut our coat according to our cloth, as Mummy and Daddy have advised us. We must actually weave the cloth that we need for the coat that we desire. And for that, we must be able to internalize and embrace the differences and the advantages that India has while differentiating between these two terms, capacity and capability. India brings to the table very large amounts of capability, which is human wherewithal, organizational structures, training mechanisms, legal frameworks, and simply regional sensitivity, which perhaps is something that countries which have got an excess or a surfeit of capacity tend to ignore, including China, thinking that money is the only thing that makes the mare go. I think that this is a very profound mistake if we adopt that particular approach, because countries that have an excess of capacity will always tend to throw capacity at a problem. And countries like India, which have huge surplus of capability, even while not having perhaps enough capacity, must play to their strong suits. And that for India is capability. Now, in a setup like the Quad, there are other players who have more capacity, and India has more capability. This is the stitch that I think will enable us to knit the fabric of the region together. Likewise, I think that it is very important for India, now that we have reached a stage of having, as Admiral Lamba said already, the Malabar and the Quad members coincident, we must not allow this opportunity to slip. What should we then do? We must capitalize upon Malabar to provide for strategic signaling. Whether that Malabar strategic signaling is limited to Malabar, whether that takes place in the Indian Ocean region or in the wider Indo-Pacific, or for that matter, in the focal area of the South China Sea, I am talking about strategic signaling must exist. It must be pursued. And therefore, India, once again, needs to internalize the concept of maneuver, because everybody knows that two armies don't go to conflict, two air forces don't go to conflict, two navies don't go to conflict, two nations go. And the concept of maneuver in India is taken as a given. But for some reason, both our civilian and the bulk of our uniformed segments tend to believe that maneuver is a concept restricted to the core sector. 33 corps, 31 corps, whatever army corps. Whereas actually, we need to apply the concept of maneuver, even in times of peace, across the theater. And understanding the theater, embracing the theater is crucial. So the Quad enables us once again to do this and to operate in maneuver while focusing our strategic signaling efforts, whatever they may be, within specific areas, whether these are in the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, or the South China Sea, or anywhere else for that matter. This, I personally have read one of my mentor's more recent pieces about the Malabar, where he said that, we couldn't muster sufficient numbers to be able to impress China. And I think that this is a mistake because it is not numbers that count here. It doesn't matter whether you can field 38 ships or 39 ships or something like that, or you can only field a more limited number, because what counts is quality. Once again, what India should be concentrating upon is to generate and parade its quality. It is wrong to think that India brings little in terms of quality to the maritime table. India actually is extraordinarily competent as a naval power in particular, and as a maritime power in general. So with those initial points, I just wanted to reiterate 2 or 3 issues, and those are that I believe that we now need to establish some significant numbers of working groups within the Quad construct. On the one hand, we need to drill downwards towards working groups for defense and infrastructure, maybe for development. This blue dot network emphasizes quality. Japan emphasizes quality. We need to emphasize quality. And so maybe the establishment of these working groups, on the one hand, that means working group on defense, working group on strategic and defense infrastructure, working group on development infrastructure, and developmental coordination, which is quite important. And then at the other end, we need to move the Quad to a point where we have actually a periodic and regular meeting of the heads of government. It is remarkably impressive that we have moved from senior officials across to ministerial levels, but now we need to take that one extra step and move this to, it is the Quad expands to the quadrilateral security framework, but it is not that security is the same as military security, and India needs to be quite clear about this and be able to impress upon the region, many of whom are uncomfortable with the thought that they might have to choose between China and some sort of Quad. But if we looked at the Quad addressing not merely military security, but those elements of economic, human, political security that will actually knit the region together, I think that we will do, it will serve a very great purpose. My last point is really a reiteration of my first, and that is that asymmetry. Do not look for symmetrical approaches in the face of challenges. Utilize the fact that we bring to bear democracies, democratic ideals, a liberal order, an order that is based upon international consensus derived extraordinarily hard by all of the world, and we are not willing to have these new rules written unilaterally by a single country, emphasizing its writ as the only one. That means no, my way or the highway will not work for India, and I dare say it will not work for the Quad. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Admiral Chauhan. Over to you, Dr. Scott. Hello, Dr. Scott. Okay, we'll get him in later. Professor Rajamohan, you can please start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Admiral. I mean, delighted to be part of this very distinguished panel, and delighted to be back at the Chandigarh Military Literature Festival. So in the limited time that I have, I mean, let me point to three paradoxes, will in the debate on the Quad that we face today. The first is the very nature of the Quad. I mean, I think has generated multiple meanings, and different people see it differently, and it triggers a whole range of ideas. For example, the idea of a new geography, Indo-Pacific as a new geography, as opposed to Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It talks about rules-based order, which means talking about actually the larger international system. It signals an attempt to construct a balance of power. We've used the term naval alliance. We could debate whether it's an alliance or a coalition, but the idea of building new institutions to deal with a new context in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. So all these meanings are simultaneously common, and I don't think we need to quibble about the exact definition. But the fact is, Quad at this point is not a military institution. It is primarily a diplomatic vehicle where diplomats meet for political consultations, for strategic coordination across the region called the Indo-Pacific. Of course, they can give guidance to their four militaries, navies, to do more things, and we've seen that express itself in the Malabar exercises and the inclusion of Australia recently. But the Quad partners are also looking beyond the military and the naval issues. For example, there was a meeting yesterday of the Quad senior officials. Among the topics they listed that figured in the conversation, resilience of regional supply chains, which is purely economic issue, countering disinformation, which is a question of managing the new media and the kind of tools it has given to states that want to interfere, promoting quality infrastructure, then of course maritime security, cyber security, securing mineral resources, counterterrorism, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So this is a wide bag of issues that the Quad is debating. At the same time, Quad is also looking at a potential expansion and diversification. We're talking about, Japanese have talked about bringing Britain and France into this. We've seen in the last few months, France has an Indo-Pacific strategy. Germany has initiated, outlined the guidelines for its approach to the Indo-Pacific. We have the Netherlands, so historically a maritime power, talk about the Indo-Pacific. So the interest and in this region, and those who might be eventually be partners, is certainly growing. Meanwhile, the Quad partners are separately looking at other minilaterals. For example, India, Australia, Japan have a framework of their own. Then you have India, Australia, France. So some things we do with the US and some things without the US. So there is an overlapping series of minilaterals that are beginning to emerge in the region. Then the Quad also has the function of coordinating in various other forums. For example, on the Indian Ocean Rim Association, where India and Australia are members. They've recently decided to admit France as a full member. There's the Indian Ocean Commission, where France has invited India to join that as an observer. There is the East Asia Summit. There is the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting. So I think you have actually a whole range of institutions, both security, economic, and more political, where the Quad can act as a nucleus for a coordination, for doing things in setting a larger agenda. So I don't want to go into the origins of the Quad, and which is both our Admiral Lamba and Admiral Chauhan have talked about it. That brings me to the question of India. I mean, I think India has repeatedly said Quad is not an alliance, and I think which is a fair point at this point. Two of the members of the Quad have treaty-based security arrangements with the US. India does not, and India does not plan to have one. And I've not heard anything where the US is offering a treaty-based alliance to India either. So I think India will be somewhat different from the other three members. But there is one question: when India never does alliances? I mean, there is one theory that India will never do alliances. I'm somewhat skeptical of that claim because India explored a specific type of military cooperation with the US in 1962, then in 1971 with the Soviet Russians. So I think it is the scale of the challenge and the kind of existential threats that you face are going to people to look for coalitions and alliances. Therefore, it is the nature of the threat, which Ambassador Saran pointed out, a lot would depend upon what China does. If China is going to keep pushing everyone around it, I think there is no choice but to come together and do more things together. That brings me to the second paradox, which is the paradox about Chinese power. It's fascinating to see China is at once the binding and the unbinding force on the Quad. That it is Chinese power and the attempt by China to dominate its neighborhood and the undermining of the equities of other, India, Japan, US, and Australia, that has brought these three countries together. The rapid rise of China, its growing military and naval power, is what is compelling these four countries to come together. But China is also the principal source of disruption. Ambassador Saran pointed out to what happened in 2007 or 2008, when Australia for one reason, the US for another reason, sought that it was, let's downplay it. Since then, the Chinese power has become much stronger. But there is the problem of how you live with power. This idea people will always resist power. We've seen in ASEAN, for example, where I am, there is a growing silence on what China does on South China Sea. So there is, you can call it the frog in warm water that is getting hotter, that way you get used to certain types of pressure, or the economic interdependencies that prevent you from taking a more concrete and specific, calling out the Chinese aggression. So if you're weak, there's a danger that you would accommodate. I mean, the Philippines case won the case in the international arbitration on every one of the 15 points that it raised. But the next president comes and says, look, no point fighting with the Chinese. Let's accommodate with the Chinese. So I think power bends people to its will. And I think the danger that asymmetry in China's power vis-a-vis its neighbors puts the region in a danger of being pacified, accommodative to rise of Chinese power. And I think this is also made worse by the repeated underestimation of Chinese power in the past. India's own experience in the 50s and later in the 90s. The US significantly underestimated the scale and rapidity of China's military and naval modernization. But that illusion has not disappeared. I'm sure there will be constant hope somehow we can persuade, coax, cajole China into a rules-based multilateral order. But I think that the temptation then to make a separate peace or hoping that you can construct a compromise with China is going to be a constant challenge for the Quad. And China has the tools like coercion or co-option, punishment or seduction. What they're doing to Australia today, in complete violation of every single economic norm, of massive punishment to Australia to recant the position that it has taken against China, the territorial aggression against India. So you have actually the capacity to punish those who do not accept its line have increased. So therefore, we all need to, the Quad members, will entering a very, very difficult phase where the Chinese ambitions are real. They're not hiding it. So, but at the same time, the temptations for a separate peace are going to be pretty strong for all of them. So if we have to navigating this phase, demands a lot more, attention, and I think a lot more need for more intensive substantive cooperation. That brings me to the last paradox about India's approach to Quad. We've had, I think traditionally Delhi, as I said, has been reluctant to engage in the Quad because of the potential of how it would look, potential that it might be misunderstood. But I think as challenges with China are beginning to deepen and the dramatic change in the balance of power between India and China, the comprehensive national power, if you will, Chinese economy is 5 times larger than India's. Chinese military spending is at least 4 times larger than India's. And therefore, you have actually what China is doing on your northern borders, what it is doing to India's primacy in South Asia, what it is doing in the Indian Ocean, present a scale of threat that India has never confronted before. And I think you have a great power on your frontiers, both in the north and in the south, and dealing with it is not going to be easy. And the old formulae with which we have dealt with ideas of US-Soviet rivalry, many of those are going to be very hard to apply because you have a power right next door. And then I would also argue that India's problem with China is far bigger than the other 3 countries. The US is far away. It can always come to an accommodation as part of a general, great power arrangement. And China is teasing the Biden administration with that idea. Japan is next door. It has similar territorial problems, maritime problems, but its economy is far more sophisticated than China's. It has options to work with China, for example, on RCEP, on a range of other issues. Australia is far away, faces no near-term existential threat from China. But what India faces then is far more severe and is only going to grow in the near years. This therefore requires, India needs more partnerships than it ever done before. And at the same time, the tradition has been one of reluctant to go too far in partnerships. The recent changes that India has undertaken are interesting, but it's not clear whether they're adequate to meet the scale and scope of challenges that Chinese power poses for Indian security, for its economic prosperity over the longer term. That brings me to the conclusion. Let me just say 3 things at the end. One, India has to move on multiple fronts of strengthening Quad where it can, strengthening other regional mechanisms where it can, that it cannot simply rest on its laurels. It needs to move much faster on partnerships, especially with the Quad probably at the core of it. Second, it has to move on multiple fronts, not just on the military front, because the way China threatens India's economic security today, it requires that it needs to do a lot more action on the economic front. And third, that there is a connection between an interactive dynamic between the international coalitions we need to build and the national capacity we need to enhance, because without that in the longer term, we can forever be dependent on the others. So therefore, this dynamic interaction between improving national capacity in partnership with others, that must be the guiding principle for which we need international coalitions, more active coalitions, more intensive coalitions, and use those coalitions to strengthen ourselves over the longer term so that we can be an effective contributor to regional and international security. And the Quad, I think, for near term at least, is going to be the central fulcrum around which much of these initiatives will have to take place. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Mohan. There are no comments or questions in the chat box. So, Ambassador Saran, there were a set of leaders who were there from beginning from 2017. You had Prime Minister Abe, and you had the President Trump administration, and the Prime Minister of Australia, and you had a certain set of relationships which were there between these leaders, and a very aggressive stance which was taken by the United States or what China has been doing in all these forums. Now, with the coming of the Biden administration and the change of the government or the Prime Minister in Japan, what do you see and how do you see the Quad moving forward in the near term?
Thank you, Admiral. My sense is that the confrontation between US and China is something which is quite structural in character. So I do not see that the drivers of that strategic confrontation between the two major powers is going to diminish under Biden. Having said that, I certainly expect that the tone of the relationship and the rhetoric of the relationship will perhaps be less confrontational than it has been in the past. But there is also something that we should keep in mind, and I refer to what Raja Mohan said, that one should not exclude the possibility, perhaps not immediately, but going forward, that in terms of their respective sort of global, interests, the United States and China may come to some kind of a bilateral understanding, some kind of a détente, like we have had in the past between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, who were strategic competitors throughout the Cold War. But that did not preclude some détente on, and especially on some important global issues. So we should keep that possibility in mind. But I believe that for the foreseeable future, we will probably see a continuation of a sharper competitiveness between the US and China. Second, you mentioned the change of leadership in Japan. Yes, we have a change in leadership, and of course, the kind of very almost passionate commitment that Shinzo Abe had to the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific, the confluence of the two oceans, the critical role that relationship with India would play in terms of managing that ocean space. What is reassuring is that we have Prime Minister Suga, who has in fact reiterated his commitment to taking the Indo-Pacific concept forward, and also the Quad as well. So I do not see there being a diminution of Japanese interest in this. And then as far as Australia is concerned, frankly, because of what is happening to Australia today, the kind of punitive actions which are being taken against Australia by China, there is likely to be a greater interest on the part of Australia to strengthen this relationship with the other Quad members, and that in a sense is already happening. So by and large, I would say that the outlook for the Quad in fact is a fairly positive one going forward.
Thank you, Ambassador Sarun. There is, Admiral Chauhan, there is a security architecture which exists in the Atlantic. Similarly, there is a security architecture in the larger Pacific. We have the new formulation of the Indo-Pacific now, which is of a recent times, without any security structures present. With the Quad moving forward, and also the Quad members participating in a maritime exercise in the form of Malabar, how do you see this moving forward in setting up some sort of a security architecture in the Indo-Pacific and getting other nations also into it?
Well, thank you very much for that excellent question. Within the Indian Ocean, we have a paradox. And the paradox is that we were one of the earliest movers, a pan-Navy Ocean Naval Symposium. And then, surprisingly, the most skittish of the countries involved, of the 38 countries involved, happened to be India. So we are occasionally, of course, I'm afraid, frightened of our shadow. And the fact that all countries' navies that belonged to the ions did not belong to the IORA, but not all countries of IORA belonged to, there are gaps in every one of these security constructs. So what then is, and therefore, while the ions remains a particularly vibrant and huge, retains its enormous potential within the region. However, I think that it's the ability of the Indian establishment to actually embrace this as the embryonic structure for security in the wider Indo-Pacific through an engagement between IONS and WPNS, for example, is this reluctance is somewhat baffling to me, and it has remained baffling for a long time. So we've got two options. One, expand the IONS so as to incorporate extra regional navies, such as the members of the Quad. This, I think, is a much easier proposition. And of course, it requires that, as I said, that the government embraces the IONS as a government-to-government security architecture. The other is to go down the path that you are, I think, suggesting, and that is to utilize the Quad as the embryo for a wider Indo-Pacific strategic architecture, which I think is much, much more difficult. Because the Quad, as soon as it leans overtly into military activities, will spook many of the countries that are just about sort of getting used to the idea of a Quad. Malabar expanding is opposed by almost everybody, and Malabar needs to remain, I think, as was said a little while ago in another forum, it needs to remain the big boys' navy. But does that mean that we don't have structures? No, it doesn't. We do have structures. So I think that the correct way to go down that particular path of creating a maritime security architecture in the region, which will then expand, is to first have the IONS being embraced, the IONS being supported more firmly than it is so far, for the IONS to be expanded, for the IONS to interface first with WPNS, and as I said, eventually, or earlier with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, thereby bringing a host of naval as well as continental powers into a more or less acceptable structure, and one which has had almost 12 years of presence, thereby allowing people to become familiar with it. Finally, I wanted to just say two things, and those were that, China and its two dreams represent to me a very major strategic mistake by China. Big nations should never give a date by which something or the other will happen, especially those big nations which lay great store by face. If in India we said that India is going to be a superpower by 2020 and it didn't happen, we'll just shrug and say, okay, 30-20. But in China, face, and the face of Xi Jinping having been conflated with the face of the Chinese party, makes this quite a different proposition. So therefore, as like a child who is preparing poorly for an examination which is drawing closer and closer, the year 2049 is upon us, and there is no post-Westphalian state that has become the number one hegemon in the world without simultaneously being the number one maritime hegemon. And for that, China will have to beat the combined maritime powers of the Quad countries and a whole heap of countries that are important with navies that are significant but not members of the Quad. This is impossible. So as China approaches 2049, like any kid, China will start to make mistakes. It will start to get more and more frenetic. Our trick is, can we find a structure within Quad whose academic credentials will are sufficient to allow us to identify what is a mistake and therefore capitalize upon that? I'm not talking about in military terms, but in strategic terms. What is a mistake? What form of behavior constitutes an error? And if we can identify that, then I think that we are in a very good position to bring China back on track as a responsible member of the global community that actually relies upon an internationally consensually based, rules-based order which will allow economic activity, particularly trade, to take place. This is the aim of the security architecture, and that I think IONS is very well placed to do, provided we can find it in ourselves to expand that. To expand Quad, much more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Chauhan. Professor Mohan, there are the members of the Quad and China have their individual relationships, their individual economic linkages, and as you also mentioned in your remarks, we are the only country which shares an unresolved land border with China. And picking up from the chat box, there are a couple of questions where Atul Kochar is asking that as democracies, how do we move fast on all fronts in countering China? And where does Taiwan stand in its relationship to the Quad?
Okay, I think a number of, before I come to these two questions, I think there is the larger question. I think, any idea that we can persuade China to accept global rules when China is getting so strong, I think will be a mistake. I think to believe somehow multilateral route of setting norms, China is going to abide by them, goes contrary to what actually China is doing. China is bending the international system. It says, look, it comes 1,500 miles into Indonesia's waters and says, I have historic rights in these waters. What they're doing is transforming, writing their own rules, whether it's WHO, WTO, they're in a power to force adoption of new rules. So this idea somehow we can simply persuade them through multilateral means, I think will be a mistake. And I think the only way you can persuade them to do anything would be to be able to demonstrate a military balance, the capacity to deter them from doing certain things, which they're doing. Unless we do that, the rest will really be, we'll get trapped in our own rhetoric about, bringing China inclusive structure. The problem is China wants to be a great power. It thinks it has the means to be a great power. It has the means to pacify its neighbors. It has the means to rewrite the rules under which the international system works, at least in the Western Pacific, and if possibly in the Indo-Pacific. Now, in that situation, I think at this point, the need is for us at the national level to restore, try and do asymmetric strategies, which Chauhan talked about, Admiral Chauhan talked about, strengthen your military capabilities, expand many lateral coalitions. Some we do with France, some we do with the US. And then the multilateral dimension can only be addressing an icing on the cake. That can't be your end goal. That can only be ways in which you can reach out to the rest. Second, I think on the question of democracies, look, democracies have no choice. By nature, they're contentious. You can see today in Australia, the Labour Party is attacking the government for messing up the China relationship. In the US, there are enough people saying, look, US is misreading, Trump has mishandled China question. It has to be redone. So I think those contentions will be there. And I think that's where the problem is, unless the power becomes really so threatening, democracies don't unite. And we've seen it from the Second World War, from a whole range of cases where unless the threat is right, near and present, it's going to be hard to convince people. But I think at least in societies where we can try and build consensus, that's what I think our job, people who are outside the government, to be able to bring together the political elites and say, look, here is a gathering threat and why we need to act. On Taiwan, after what's happened to Hong Kong, Taiwan will be the test. Taiwanese are really in a very panic mode because every day Chinese aircraft are violating the air defense zone. The capacity to keep pushing. And I think the Chinese are essentially saying two things. In punishing Australia, they're saying, here is we're going to kill the chicken to scare the monkey. And Australia is no chicken. It's a big kangaroo. And they're telling you, if we can punish a G20 member with the economic means, others will have no choice but to accept. Second thing it is doing is A distant relative, as the Chinese proverb goes, a distant relative, your ally, is not going to save you from your neighbor. So I think he's going to force very difficult choices. And I think Xi Jinping has made it absolutely clear he's not going to give it an easy time. But Taiwan is really, that's why it's looking for partners. It's looking for security cooperation. And I tell you, if the US, if all of us, even we don't stand up for others. We're only so focused on our own security. So unless there is more solidarity between different parts of the Indo-Pacific and saying aggression must be stopped, then the Chinese capacity to pick each one separately is going to be then. We've seen it in the case of Hong Kong. So little has happened in terms of the reaction. So there we are. I think if Taiwan falls, my sense is after that, the credibility of the US alliance in Australia and Japan would be fundamentally challenged. And if you look at the map, Taiwan is the heart of the South China Sea. It is a link between Western Pacific and the Central Pacific. And if that falls, the whole story is going to be dramatically different. Therefore, the need for solidarity between those who are facing Chinese aggression, and I think there we need to do a lot more, all those of us in Asia. And I think if we don't do that, each one of us is going to be hung separately, and if we don't hang together. But Taiwan is going to be probably the most critical feature of security, and that would turn the dynamics in this whole region in the coming year.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Saran, the point which Professor Raja Mohan has raised about all the Bretton Woods organizations which were set up post the Second World War, and now China has been unilaterally their own advantages. How, in your opinion, can like-minded countries, even beyond the Quad, work to ensure or get to the reality of what the world is today and not what it was post 1945?
Thank you, Admiral. I think it is fairly obvious by now to all the countries in the world that the international landscape today is very, very different from what it was post Second World War. And the order which came into existence after the Second World War, which is basically the liberal international order, don't forget, it was really sort of supported by the overwhelming power of the United States of America. So even if we are talking about rules of the game today, those rules have been put in place as a result of the overwhelming power of the United States of America. Now, those rules, those institutions are being challenged by China, and I think the question is whether we go along with the rewriting of rules, whether we go along with the creation of perhaps a different set of international institutions, which would be essentially dominated by China, or do we try to resist it? I think that's the plain and simple, dilemma that is in front of us, because China is also in the process of creating some of those kind of international institutions, international processes. It is trying to put in place Chinese standards for some of the new technologies, for example, which are coming up. So really, the question is whether we acquiesce in that, or whether we try to resist it. Now, this is where I think the point made by Raja Mohan, I think, is very relevant, that what is the level of threat which is perceived by the so-called, democratic nations, those who benefited a great deal from the liberal international order. Is there a willingness to really come together to deal with this kind of threat? The record on that, I must say, is not very encouraging. That in fact, that kind of number one, a sense of existential threat is certainly not there. And the willingness to overcome some of the major differences which separate us, that also does not seem to be in evidence. So I'm not very sure that it is possible for India to really take the lead in trying to get mobilize international opinion to really try to safeguard some of the post-war liberal institutions. This is something which will require a much larger effort on the part of the democratic countries. What I think, in terms of India's interests, what I think is possible is that we try to establish different kinds of partnerships for different kinds of ends. I think we are living in a world where coalitions are likely to form around issues rather than coalitions which will be of the traditional alliance kind which we have had in the past. So are there ways in which we can really develop those kind of strong partnerships based on some common concerns, some kind of common objectives that we have? And that is, I think, certainly possible, except that I do believe that perhaps India has not understood fully that as important as the security pillar is, so is the economic pillar. And I have made this point again and again, that you cannot play a more expansive international role, a more expansive regional role, unless you also are becoming a very active participant in the economic dynamism that is on display, for example, in the East Asia, Southeast Asia country. So from that point of view, perhaps not going ahead with our membership of the RCEP was perhaps not the best decision which could have been taken, because if you are trying to build up a constituency of countries which can be in partnership with you, that economic partnership is as important as the security partnership. That's my perspective. The other aspect, of course, is how do we try and, to the extent that we can, try to shape the external environment in a manner which can support India's own developmental objectives. Because the only long-term solution to being able to deal with the Chinese challenge is by India itself, developing its economic capabilities, science and technology capabilities, its defense capabilities. But all that is dependent upon how successful you are as an economy. And I frequently, refer back to the period between 2003 and 2007, part of the time I was foreign secretary. Even though there was a power gap between India and China, the difference was that China's economy was, in a sense, slowing down. The Indian economy was growing at the rate of about 8 to 9% per annum. If you go back to that period, the discourse at that time, international discourse at that time, was that India may actually become the next China. So even though India was not as large an economy as China, it was seen as shrinking the power gap between the two countries. Today, the situation is the opposite. Since the global financial and economic crisis, the gap between India and China, instead of shrinking, has actually been expanding. Just as the gap between the US and China has been shrinking. So this has created a very different kind of an international dynamic. But at that time, because of the fact that we were seen as shrinking that gap, it opened up a huge diplomatic space for us. It is in that context that something like the Indo-US nuclear deal became possible, because we were seen as a strong emerging power. Or even the Quad that we talked about. the fact is that our performance, in a sense, during the tsunami crisis, demonstrated to the world that here is a country with very major, significant naval capabilities. And it has a certain reach, which not many countries have. So, the international perception about India changed. Unfortunately, today we are in a different situation. We are in a very defensive situation today. And I think that is what we have to come to terms with. Most importantly, what is it that is necessary in order to change the internal economic dynamic itself in India and bring back India to a high growth trajectory? And in bringing that about, how can we mobilize our strong partnerships with Japan, strong partnership with the United States of America, which are still the world's leading, technological powers, economic powers? How can we leverage that really to transform India's own economy? Because if we are able to at least begin to do that, even start on that path, that itself will enable us to deal with the China challenge more effectively than is possible today. Thank you.
Admiral Chauhan and Professor Rajamohan, would you like to come in on this point?
Yes, I certainly would. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always a privilege to listen to Ambassador Shamsaran. However, it is a mistake, in my opinion, to place geoeconomics and geopolitics and geostrategy on the same horizontal plane. Geoeconomics will drive everything. So every country, including India, in dealing either independently or in conjunction with other countries, will have a set of geoeconomic aims, goals. And for India, we must then develop a set of geostrategies to actually pursue and attain those goals. That's where geostrategies lie. Now, in order to ensure that those geostrategies actually work, we must put in place a certain set of assurance mechanisms. And to ensure us from the disadvantages, should those geostrategies threaten not to work, we must have insurance mechanisms. These assurance and insurance mechanisms are the instruments of India's foreign policy, both diplomatic and military. But it's a mistake, I think, in the popular discourse to shift this upwards, to say that it is an either-or proposition between military geostrategic activity or plans and geoeconomic. They're not on the same plane. The typology is wrong. For the typology to be correct, the geoeconomic goals and, in many cases, non-geoeconomic goals of India, which might mean anything from just I want to be numero uno pa, or much more commonly encountered examples such as people-to-people connectivity, which are non-geoeconomic essentially. But geoeconomic goals drive the creation, the formulation, and thereafter the execution of geostrategies. Geostrategies then drive the requirement for military strategies. And therefore, in no argument should we be able to put these at the same horizontal plane and argue one against the other. Second, I entirely agree with the Ambassador Shamsaran that we cannot have a lopsided situation where India is attempting to do things in the assurance and insurance level when India is unable to generate an adequate geostrategy to pursue its geoeconomic goals. And departing from, big powers cannot afford to sulk. India can't say it's my ball, I'm going home, and walk out of the RCEP because at a given point in time, the RCEP has implications on the service industry and the fear that we will be flooded by cheap Chinese goods. I think this smacks of a certain amount of arrogance in believing that you know exactly how the Indian economy will react. This was exactly the same argument when we opened up retail to America. And we didn't find that Indian retailers in the processed food industry simply rolled over and sort of died. Nothing of the sort happened. Indian products thrived. And I would venture that it may or it may not happen, but for India to admit defeat and walk out of RCEP on 2 counts, that the rest of them are not willing to give us the concessions we need in terms of services, and secondly, that we are terrified that cheap Chinese and other Southeast Asian goods will flood the Indian market and scotch the Indian entrepreneurial spirit, I think is, how did we decide this on behalf of the rest of the country, sitting in one citadel in New Delhi? How did that happen? And so I believe that India, if it wants, India is quite a lot, I'm afraid, like the cat in the Shakespearean adage in Macbeth, where India, the cat wants the fish, but it doesn't want to get its paws wet. If India has a set of geo-economic goals, then India must devise bold strategies, because otherwise it is trying to compete, as I said in the beginning, on conceptual levels of symmetry. Tell me a case, sir, where we have taken the low temperature thermal desalination capabilities of India, used it as a foreign policy tool. Have we done that? Where have we taken Indian engineering entrepreneurial spirit and capacity and capability and taken it across to the Maldives, saying, you have an existential threat, we'll handle it? Where are we showing that our geostrategy is indeed supportive of our geo-economic aims, goals, and ambitions? Instead, we are entering into this incessant and, to my mind at least, totally infructuous argument about whether we could have or should have a military strategy which is to be equated with either favorably or unfavorably with our economic one. And so I think that it is high time that we actually understood, internalized the typology of how we want to proceed and how the world will proceed. We have strengths. We should be able to utilize those strengths along a strategic endpoint, so that the strategy that will lead to that endpoint will in fact be capable of taking us from where we are in a place called from to a place called to. I think I'll stop there and allow Professor Rajamohan to continue.
Yeah, Lamba, I thought there's no point now crying over spilt milk. The RCEP is done deal. I don't see we're going back into that. There, I think, on the question of bringing your economic strategy in to reinforce what you're doing on the military side, there again, I think the Quad is offering us a path. So when we today talk about the Quad Plus, where immediately after the pandemic, we saw the constitution of Quad Plus that brought in Vietnam, New Zealand, South Korea sometimes, Brazil, Israel some other time, of actually developing a coordination on the health-related issues, of managing the pandemic, of creating new supply lines on the whole range of areas relating to the. So that is an opening that we've seen. Some of the follow-up we've seen, India, Australia, Japan have agreed to work together to do resilient supply chains. That the idea that, look, if China is weaponizing economic interdependence, there is a recognition in Japan, in Australia, in India, and the US that, look, we need to find alternatives. And I think that's where India still presents the kind of alternative that you can do. And therefore, pursuing that path is where I think our future is, because there's no way of going back, of course, into what has already been being done. So the trick is not whether we go back into RCEP or not, but are we capable of doing any trade deal with anyone in the world? I think the problem in the last few years has been that we've completely shut down on FTAs. Last few weeks, we've heard some government spokesmen say, look, they're open to engaging US, Britain, Europe today on a fresh round of free trade agreements, where the complementarities are probably much stronger. So therefore, integrating trade into your economics, into your larger security strategy today becomes very important, because the Chinese power over the longer term can only be controlled. Similarly, on the 5G issue, there has been great coordination. The attempt at saying, look, democracies must come together to be able to prevent China from constructing a digital Silk Road that's going to be tuned to Chinese centrality. So there again, I think some debate has started. Britain has talked about initially a D10 that can come, democracy 10 that can come together to talk about how to deal with 5G. Now, Prime Minister Johnson has invited Prime Minister Modi to come to what is being called a D10 summit when G7 meets in London next summer. He's invited India, South Korea, and Australia to be part of it. So I think the pathways are opening. The question is how quickly, how effectively can our economic system adapt to the new opportunities that are coming, I think is the challenge. And I think there are today ways forward. There again, the Quad Plus and related on the D10 now. Similarly, on the technology side, there are a whole range of new ideas that are coming that on technology cooperation, we can construct a grouping of like-minded countries. So these are just at the beginning, and I think we need to invest and explore what these bring in the next few years. And I think that's where, if our policy, particularly the economic and trade policy, have the flexibility to connect with at least some people in the world, that I think if we can demonstrate that in the next few years, the next few months or years, I think that will be a huge compensation for our inability to join the Asian economic integration under the leadership of China.
Thank you, Raja Mohan. We have a couple of minutes left. I'll give a minute each to make any of you want to make a final comment. Ambassador Saran. So you're muted.
Thank you. Not much to add really to what has been a very substantive discussion, and I would like to thank my co-panelists for bringing their own rich perspectives to this subject. Let me just conclude by pointing out that we are going to be facing a very new kind of a geopolitical landscape, particularly after this pandemic. I think there has been some reshuffling of the power equations across the world. And my sense is that other things taking into account, China is probably going to emerge as an even stronger power than before the pandemic, which is ironic because the pandemic actually, erupted in China. But it appears that on balance, China is the one which will probably come out of this in a stronger pole position than perhaps before. So I think to that extent, the challenge that we will be facing, at least from China, which has the most direct impact on India's security interests, that is perhaps going to be more serious, more complex than it has been in the past. Therefore, I think the importance of looking at what are the countervailing strategies, what are the asymmetric strategies that we need to explore in trying to deal with, as I said, a much more difficult situation. And I think a acceleration in terms of the process of crystallization of something like the Quad will have to be one part of that exercise. Thank you.
Admiral Chauhan.
Thank you. I'll just add a couple of points, and that's it. One of them is that I fully agree that, with Professor Rajamohan, that India is currently actually uncomfortable and unfamiliar with dealing with a militarily adversarial great power. It has dealt with adversarial great powers in the past, but a militarily aggressive, assertive great power who considers India as one of the targets of its military aggression or assertiveness, is a new phenomenon, and India is not, the Indian establishment is not yet familiar or comfortable with this. And the way to get India quickly familiar and comfortable is for India to be able to open its doors to maybe to academia, to think tanks, because the existing establishment is conditioned in the way it is conditioned. My last point with regard to Quad plus or a plus quad. You know, if we are going to have a strong and meaningful relationship with, say, Australia, then we simply have to give primacy along the eastern segment of our thrust lines of Act East policy and so on to Indonesia. If Indonesia and India can sing from the same page, then it is extraordinarily difficult for anybody to play any religious card. Second, Indonesia sits astride every one of the international choke points that connect the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean in either direction. So Australia and India are like two kids with a can and string telephone, which some of you may remember. Indonesia is the string, and we need to be much more nimble in our approach to the sensitivities that China has disturbed in the Indonesian mind, and much more proactive. Likewise is the case with Vietnam. The rapidity with which we should be responding, even if we don't want to do anything more than issue a statement. But a statement at least should come. What is the purpose of our sulking that when we needed it, you didn't give a statement in the past, now we won't give a statement now? These sorts of approaches, I think, they lack a certain degree of the maturity that we need, plus the nimbleness, as I said, the adroitness, the dexterity we need if we're going to be dealing with a great power that is militarily adversarial towards India, namely China. Can the Quad help? Of course, it's a major tool, but as Professor Rajamohan said, it gives us opportunities. Now, can we take those? Can we seize those? Because these are fleeting opportunities. And if we are going to be ponderous in our approach, as has been unfortunately the case in the past too frequently, if we're going to argue ourselves to a standstill on every case, then we will miss those opportunities. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Bond.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, Admiral, just three concluding thoughts. I mean, I think one, to reaffirm that let's not underestimate the scale of the Chinese ambition today, the power they have in their command, and the political will today Xi Jinping can mobilize. And I think this is an extraordinary moment, I think, in our revolution. And we underestimated Chinese power in the 1950s. In the 90s, we thought we can work with the Chinese to build a multipolar world. And now we find ourselves in a unipolar Asia. So I think the consequences of underestimating Chinese power are going to be very, very high. Second, we have no choice but to redress the imbalance of power that has come vis-a-vis China. And I think we have to explore multiple means, bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral, minilateral, or multilateral. I think that requires a full-fledged, a strategy that explores multiple dimensions in which we can deal with this challenge, because India never had a great power on its frontier, which is what we have today. It's interesting. China has actually had that problem. The US sat on the first island chain since the end of the Second World War, and yet within a period, it fought with China in 1950s, fought with the US in the Korean War. 18 years later, it was drawing closer to the Americans, and today it's in a position to replace the Americans. So I think we need to have a strategy which eventually turns this to our advantage through partnerships, and both economic and military. And finally, I think I would go with the other panelists. The asymmetric thinking is critical. Though we might be weak vis-a-vis China, our basic potential is by no means inconsiderable. And I think we will be the third largest economy. We still have a large military capabilities. The question is, how do we develop asymmetric strategies to deal with China on our frontiers, where we have to deal with them unilaterally, and how we work with the others in deterring a Chinese aggression in the region? Because I don't see Southeast Asia at all today ready to confront the dominance of the Chinese power. They cannot stand up to one of their own members being violated. So it's going to be very, very hard for them. They've been sucked into the Chinese orbit on the economic side. So for them, it's going to be a lot more wrenching than it is for us. So therefore, we must recognize the weaknesses and build where there is political will, for example, in the Quad, to strengthen that and to create, and then hopefully we begin to draw the others into our coalition. And finally, I think we have to work with Asian nationalism, because in the end, Asian nations fought against the European imperialists, liberated themselves. They're not going to simply roll over to the Chinese over the longer term. There will be elites who are compromised through economic seduction. But I think we need to support, we need to call out Chinese hegemony, we need to call out Chinese neocolonialism. If we do that, then your openings are going to be more, rather than hoping that somehow we can draw them in like we thought in the 50s or like we thought in the 90s. Is not going to work.
Thank you. We have run out of time. At the outset, I'd like to thank my co-panelist, Ambassador Saran, Admiral Chauhan, and Professor Rajamohan for a substantial discussion. I am not going to try and summarize what we have discussed in the last 1.5 hours. The mute point is there is a growing China with a growing national capability and power, with the will and the means to change the world, especially in Asia around. She is the largest by miles a power in Asia. And we need to stand up and look at a whole of government approach in tackling how do we face this new challenge which is there on our northern frontiers. On behalf of all four of us, I'd like to thank the Military Lit Fest of Chandigarh and their team for giving us this opportunity to have this discussion with all of you. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was